Hi all, let's look at another very exciting game from the candidates tournament, the World Championship candidates. Vladimir Kramnik against Levon Aronian. So this is in round 10. E4 from Vladimir, E5, Nf3 Nc6, and instead of getting a royal pairs, we get Joker piano territory. Bishop c4, bishop c5. This indicates Joker piano as soon as black plays that. Now white plays knight c3, so this is a little bit what many of us would have played in school, this kind of system, with an emphasis on the f7 soft spot. So schoolboy opening, knight f6, d3, a6, and now knight d5. So moving a piece twice in the opening, but there's a good reason here. It removes the defensive knight around the king when black castles later, if black wants to take. He did take here, because otherwise he might be running into an annoying bishop g5 anyway. So he took, bishop takes, d6, and now bishop e3, offering double pawns. White wants some pressure on the f file. So this is the price to pay. And the double pawns in the center are covering key squares anyway. So it can be quite dangerous for black, this kind of position. Let's see now. Both sides castle. Now knight b8, so going to reroute the knight, maybe kicking the bishop soon and rerouting the knight somewhere, and also releasing the c pawn, of course. Now white plays quite an interesting move here. You might think just give the bishop a square light on a2, but actually we have b4, so that's more aggressive, it seems, than a3. It does mean the bishop can be shielded a bit as well from things like knight a5 later, perhaps. We have knight d7, queen d2, c6, bishop b3, a5. That's one issue though with a pawn on b4. It can be attacked more easily. It's supported here. Knight f6, h3, so stopping any use of the g4 square, h6, rook ab1, so avoiding the possibility of a rook coming off. And that's extra tension in the position. The rooks, both rooks still on, mean there could be a battery later using this f file, for example. b5, which does weaken c6. It seems a little bit of a pedantic move in a way, queen c3. It just hits c6. You might think, what's really the point of this? Okay, let's see. Bishop d7. Now we have rook f2. And maybe white is glad that black didn't exchange off one pair of rooks, because this can be fun to have a battery here against f6, because then there's the possibility of an exchange sacrifice which could rupture black's king side. But black is now picking on a pawn, the e3 pawn, tying down, it seems, a whole rook. It's not that easy to defend that e3 pawn. The queen doesn't necessarily want to go back here immediately. We have rook e1, so it seems as though still it seems pretty safe for both sides at the moment, even though white's got this potentially latent f file pressure. But now knight h4 is played. The f5 square is a bit of a concern for black. c5, this does seem like quite a good position at the moment. a4 is even possible, perhaps, just to put the bishop on a2 and then challenge it, taking out the sting of many of white's pieces here, especially that bishop on a2. For example, this position with c5, this should be an even position if we look at this. It seems pretty solid. Okay, but c5 is played. Now we have the battery emerging. Rook joins its fellow rook, and there is seemingly a big idea of rook takes f6 all of a sudden. So this f file which white got from the opening, he's really celebrating that f file. Now black actually plays c takes b4, and here it gets very interesting. White actually, believe it or not, drops the queen back. He doesn't recapture on b4. If a takes b4, then maybe like taking here, and then things like queen a5 are possible. He just doesn't recapture. He actually just plays queen e1, so still holding the e3 pawn, so a pawn sacrifice. d5, so this is a very, very interesting position to check out. If b takes, then it is dangerous, this exchange sack. For example, rook takes f6, rook takes f6. This is quite dangerous. For example, here, rook f8 check, rook takes f7. This is like crashing through, in fact. Here, this is like mating line, knight g6 checkmate. Yeah, it's or king here, knight g6 threatening queen h8. Black will be forced to give up the queen, and it's hopeless for black. So it's all pretty dangerous with this exchange sack. So I don't think black can afford to try and nab another pawn there. So queen e1, very, very dangerous position for black. So d5 is played, which at least blunts the bishop. So not pinning that pawn on f7. We have now a takes now. D takes e4 is white's centre crumbling. B takes a5, trying to lure the queen away from f6 perhaps. Rook takes a5 was played. In fact, if queen takes a5 here, there's a strong move which technically it's queen d1. It gives the idea that, you know, maybe rook takes f6 and queen h5 later, for example. But there's also other ideas like playing for d4 here, and this is very nice. These ideas now of bringing in the queen or winning the bishop on d7. So this is very, very dangerous, this whole thing here. If ed after d4, if ed, then rook f6, and then the queen can come to h5. And you can see white's pieces working well together on the attack. For example, like this, knight f5, there's menacing mating net threats. Like check here, check, rook f4. This is going to be actually winning for white, even if black queen's here. White has a big advantage. Well, absolutely winning is going to be mating there. So yeah, it's very, very dangerous stuff around here. So we do see actually rook takes a5, knight g6, using that pinned pawn. So there's more threats emerging now. Black played bishop e6. There's ideas, for example, of rook takes f6 and queen g3 here. So bishop e6, trying to neutralize this attacking piece, be giving up the e5 pawn though, but e takes d3. Here, bishop takes b3 is dangerous, rook takes, g takes, knight d7 is an annoying move, hitting the queen and hitting f6. For example, this position is a big advantage to white. So after knight takes e5, e takes d3, but now we do have rook takes f6, g takes, rook takes, pinning the bishop. A clever move by Levon Aronian. d2, very dangerous pawn, but white really wants to carry on with his kingside attack. He doesn't want to be distracted by this pawn. It would be a major distraction and probably losing the game to take it. If this pawn is taken, queen g3 was played. If it's taken, check, and here, if king f2, then there's queen a5. So that's really annoying. And if the queens come off, then that's the end of any sort of attacking potential. Black has a small edge there. And if here king h2, then queen b8, nasty pin on e5. For example, queen d4, taking that knight's pinned and more pressure on it. Queen takes a1, it doesn't matter because this position, that knight is pinned, bishop's controlling even f5. So black ends up just the bishop up there. So it's a poison pawn to take, basically, this d2. So it is ignored. White just wants to get on with his attack. Queen g3 check is played. Now here, king f8. If we look at other alternatives, they're quite fascinating. Well, the king h8 is readily refuted. Rook takes h6, checkmate. Thanks very much. But King h7, I want to test you on. Can you see a winning move for white here, which is very, very nice? If I give you 5 seconds to pause the video. White play here. Right, this bishop, it seems to have been stopped in its tracks here. The whole diagonal blocked. But actually, it can actually use this diagonal, believe it or not, with the energetic c4, making way for bishop c2. The only way for black to actually stop bishop c2. Let's see the effect of bishop c2, just to show check, and then rook takes h6 mating. The only way to actually stop bishop c2 is to give up the pawn and take rook a2 here to stop bishop c2. But in this position, knight takes f7 anyway is pretty crushing. It's murderous because of that pin there, and threatening rook takes h6. So for example, rook d2, rook takes h6 mate. So this is absolutely murderous, this position. It's pretty complicated stuff, but yeah, so that looks to be a wonderful winning move if that was played. So we had in this position king f8, which is the safest, and it seems to run into knight d7 check. So this is complicated in its own right, but remember there's a pawn here. White actually wasn't tempted by knight d7 check, because look, we're exploiting the pin to win the queen. White played rook f1 because that pawn is pretty scary. If he plays knight d7 check, black can play bishop takes d7. Rook takes f7 though is checkmate here. Forget about taking the queen. That's actually checkmate. Yeah, that's the slight snag with that. Now if king e7, this position actually with the check here, the pawn is really dangerous. But white needs extra time here. I believe in this position that there's quite severe threats. I mean, black needs to gain a tempo, and he can do with this check here to queen with check to make sure there's no dangers to his king. And technically, if black can weather the storm, for example, like this, then black should be fine. Black should have a small or clear edge emerging. So very, very complicated stuff here. Mega complex game. So knight d7 check, although tempting, we have actually this retreat. Rook f1. Yeah, it's an exciting game. Rook a7 is played. If we look at this position, this is poison because of knight d7 check, winning the queen. Knight d7, clearly winning the queen there. So rook a7, knight g6 check, king g7, knight f4 check, king h8. Now knight h5 threatening mate, and also this diagonal is dangerous here. So black is really on the defensive here. f6 is played, which defends laterally, g7. If rook g8, then queen e5 check. This position is very good because knight d7 check is winning the queen there. We can just snap off the queen. So let's go back. So knight h5, f6 is a good defensive try. Knight takes f6, rook f8. Yeah, there were other possibilities here. Let's see. Instead of rook f8, if d1 queening to try and distract the rook. Sorry, no, we can just take that pawn. Pardon me. Wanting to mention something here. On rook d8, we can take here. No, on d1 queen. Pardon me. Sorry, this is what I wanted to mention. Forget taking on d1. Queen f4. This is only, yeah, this is complicated, but nope. Let's go back to the main game continuation. Rook f8, queen f4, Rook h7 is played, Queen e5, but here Levon Aronian blunders horribly. There is a way to stay in the game here. This does seem like there's menacing threats in this position, which are pretty nasty. He plays actually one of the worst moves on the board, which is Queen c7. Yeah, can you see how white wins here? There's two moves which are absolutely decisive in this position of equal strength, and white played one of them. If I give you 5 seconds here, what would you play in this position? Okay, either knight h5 or knight e8 is the same effect, offering the queen. It's with check. If queen takes, then we have this beautiful mate. Rook takes f8, the knight's guarding g7. Bishop g8, rook takes g8, checkmate. So that's one of the beautiful ideas of this. It works the same way actually with knight h5, because it's covering g7, so we have the same mechanism in place. That's checkmate. So here, let's look at it more closely though for other defensive tries here. Why they resign exactly. So if king g8, then the bishop goes, and this is not very good news for black. For example, like this, knight f6 check, queen g4. This is a way of forcing checkmate. Actually, queen e8 check, knight e4 is checkmate, to try and force a checkmate there with accurate play. If we stick the queen in, yeah, that's pretty desperate stuff. We can take here, it doesn't matter about black queening. Check, and then check, for example, and then actually we can even go for the kill here with queen g7 checkmate, because that rook is pinned. So it does seem pretty hopeless here, whatever black does. If he sticks a rook in front, we just take that. Yeah, we're just scooping everything away, basically. Okay. So yeah, that was an unfortunate mistake here. Now let's look at this position with before queen c7. It's a difficult defensive task now. There's pieces pointing at the black king. So instead of queen c7, rook g7, but this requires giving up the bishop, clearly. If queen, let's rule out queen takes e6, this position, rook takes f6, deflecting the rook away from the pawn, is black's much better there. So bishop takes e6. Black has actually rook g5 here. Now this is really scary stuff to visualize, because this queen is the one which is to be feared, but here it's actually directly attacked just in time. And for example, this sequence with the check here, knight h5 check, giving up the queen, is actually enough for white to draw, believe it or not. I know this is a lot of crazy variations in this game. If king g6, knight f4 is checkmate, and if here it's just drawing here with perpetual check. Yeah. If white, yeah, I mean, what other things does white do here? Because otherwise e3 could be dropping, so this is probably the safest thing to do here now, to bail out for a draw with knight h5 check. So it maybe was designed for a draw, not for a win. With best play, it can be designed for a draw anyway, the whole idea of the queen sack. But in the game, it turned out to be a win because of this horrendous, yeah, this was a howler, what was played in the game. So it was getting difficult, but yeah, queen c7 just loses to either knight e8 or knight h5. So a mega complex game. I must admit I was getting lost in the variations myself. I need clearer documentation for these sort of games. Crazy stuff. And yeah, the attention has been on Vladimir Kramnik. He's really creating some exciting, mega exciting games from this World Championship candidate. So thank you, Levon Aronian, for for being on the black side of this, and thank you to Vladimir for another wonderfully dynamic, aggressive game, and not just bailing out with some meek draw just to see out the end of the tournament. No, he really had a big fighting spirit in this game from the outset. So wonderful stuff. Comments, questions, likes, shares appreciated. Thanks very much.